It was 11 p.m. on November 14th, 1942. Across the black, glassy water north of Guadalcanal, 9 Japanese warships slipped silently through the night, unseen, unheard, and certain they were alone. But 18,000 yards away, aboard the USS Washington, a different kind of vision was at work. In the dim glow of the Combat Information Center, green echoes pulsed across the screens of the SG surface search radar. Each sweep of the antenna painted a precise constellation of enemy ships, their positions updating with clockwork rhythm. To the naked eye, the Pacific was nothing but darkness. To Washington's radar operators, it was alive with targets. For 16 months, her crew had drilled relentlessly with this strange new technology, SG radar that could spot ships at ranges once dismissed as fantasy, and the Mark III fire control radar that could lock onto a target and compute a firing solution even in total blackness. Together, these instruments gave Washington the power to fight what she could not see, to strike like a blind giant guided by electricity and math. Yet few in the Pacific Fleet truly believed it would matter. Battleships, they said, were relics, floating gun platforms good only for protecting carriers. The age of surface duels had ended at Pearl Harbor, but on this night that belief would be shattered, hidden in the dark. 3,700 Americans waited at their battle stations aboard Washington. In minutes, they would be plunged into the most savage surface fight of the Pacific War, a storm of fire that would test not just the ship's steel, but the very idea of what a battleship could still be. USS Washington was no ordinary ship. She was the second of the North Carolina-class battleships, laid down at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in June of 1938, a monument of American steel and engineering ambition. Her massive hull displaced 35,000 tons on paper, nearly 45,000 when fully loaded. 9 16-inch Mark VI guns sat in triple turrets, each capable of flinging a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell over 20 miles. 16 inches of belt armor shielded her vitals. Her turbines poured out 121,000 horsepower, pushing her sleek hull through the ocean at 28 knots. She could take punishment, outrun danger, and deliver destruction in return. But in 1942, Washington was a masterpiece without a purpose. Navy doctrine had declared her kind obsolete. Admirals now spoke of carriers as the future. Swift, untouchable, decisive battleships, once the pride of fleets, had been reduced to glorified bodyguards, screens of flak protecting the precious flat tops. Since Pearl Harbor, Washington had been kept on a leash, sent across the Atlantic to serve alongside the British home fleet, then dispatched to the Pacific, yet never once allowed to unleash her main battery against an enemy ship. Her 16-inch guns had never fired in anger. The Navy called it prudence to her crew. It felt like imprisonment. 3 nights before that November battle, the cost of such caution had already been paid in blood. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, leading a cruiser-destroyer group without battleship support, had charged into the same waters off Guadalcanal. It should have been a strong force. Heavy cruisers, San Francisco and Portland, light cruisers, Helena, Atlanta, and Juneau, with 8 destroyers screening ahead. But without a single battleship among them, Callahan faced the Japanese bombardment fleet blind. What followed was chaos. A nighttime brawl fought at point-blank range, searchlights flashing, guns firing in every direction. American ships blasted one another in the confusion. When dawn came, 4 destroyers lay sunk. 2 admirals were dead, and 706 Americans would never return home. The Japanese lost little, a few destroyers, 1 crippled battleship, and by the next day, their guns were again free to pound the Marines clinging to Henderson Field. That was the moment when Admiral Chester Nimitz realized the truth. Doctrine had failed him. Carriers were wounded, the Marines were hanging on by a thread, and Guadalcanal itself was 1 bombardment away from disaster. If the Navy wanted to save it, someone would have to break the rules and send the battleships into the fight. In the wake of Callahan's shattered task force, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the after-action reports from Pearl Harbor with growing dread. The picture they painted was grim. The Marines on Guadalcanal were running out of men, ammunition, and time. Henderson Field, the single runway that made the island worth all the suffering, was being shelled night after night by Japanese warships. Now, intelligence warned of something even worse. A new Japanese strike force was heading south. Admiral Nobutaka Kondo's bombardment group. At its heart was the battleship Kirishima, backed by 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Their mission was simple and devastating: flatten Henderson Field, then shield the landing of 11,000 fresh Japanese troops. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall, and with it, the first American foothold in the Pacific. Every rule in the Navy's playbook told Nimitz what not to do. Battleships were never to sail without carrier cover. Carriers were never to risk their escorts in surface combat. Enterprise, the only surviving American carrier in the South Pacific, was still limping from her last fight, patched and fragile, her air group depleted. If he sent his 2 battleships forward, Washington and South Dakota, and they were sunk, Enterprise would be left defenseless. But if he didn't send them, Guadalcanal would die. It was an impossible choice, one that no desk-bound doctrine could answer. And so, against every principle he'd ever been taught at the Naval War College, Nimitz made the call that would change the course of the Pacific War. He radioed Admiral William Halsey: "Release the battleships. Let them go in alone. No carriers, no air cover, just steel, radar, and nerve." The man Halsey chose to command this desperate mission was Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, Jr., a quiet Kentuckian with a mind like a gun sight and the patience of a teacher. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, Jr. didn't look like the kind of man who would change the course of a war. He was short and stout, with round glasses that always seemed to slide down his nose, and uniforms that never quite fit. His voice carried a Kentucky drawl that made him sound more like a patient schoolteacher than a naval officer. Yet behind that mild exterior lived one of the sharpest tactical minds in the United States Navy. Born in the tiny town of Natley, Kentucky, Lee graduated from the Naval Academy in 1908 and spent the next 3 decades mastering the art of shooting, not just in theory, but in the kind of instinctive precision that comes from obsession. At the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, he won 5 gold medals, 2 silvers, and a bronze in marksmanship. He could put 10 bullets through the same hole at 1,000 yards. To him, ballistics wasn't math, it was music. When he turned his focus from rifles to naval guns, that same sense of rhythm followed him. A 16-inch naval rifle was, in his mind, simply a larger instrument. The physics were the same. You calculated the lead, judged the target's motion, and struck before the other man even knew where to aim. But Lee's true gift wasn't just accuracy, it was vision. He understood something that many of his peers dismissed, that radar wasn't a novelty, it was a revolution. Where other admirals still trusted searchlights and optics, Lee saw that radar could make the night itself an ally. A ship equipped with it could see through darkness, smoke, and storm, could strike without warning, could kill what it couldn't even see. For 6 relentless months, he drilled his crew aboard Washington in radar-directed gunnery. He tore apart the Navy's outdated fire control procedures, rewiring communication channels so that radar operators spoke directly to gunnery officers. No delays, no middlemen, just data and firepower moving as one. To many in the fleet, Lee's method seemed strange, even reckless. But to Lee, it was the future. He knew that one day the Navy would have to fight blind, guided only by radar and instinct. What he didn't know yet was that the night of November 14th, 1942, would be that test, and that Washington would become the proof of everything he believed. The task force Lee inherited looked impressive on paper. 2 of America's newest battleships, Washington and South Dakota, escorted by 4 destroyers, Walke, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. Together, they formed Task Force 64. But beneath the statistics was chaos. The destroyers had been scraped together from different commands, each trained under different officers with different procedures. South Dakota had only just arrived from repairs after taking a bomb hit at the Battle of Santa Cruz. Her crew was green, barely acquainted with their ship, and utterly unfamiliar with the others. They had one day to become a fighting unit. The problems went deeper than inexperience. Washington and South Dakota couldn't even talk to each other properly. Their radio systems ran on different frequencies. Their recognition codes didn't match. Lee discovered the incompatibility only after they'd already put to sea. Improvising on the fly, he ordered signal lights, prearranged maneuvers, and silence. The fleet would fight the old-fashioned way, with discipline, timing, and trust.
The destroyers faced their own grim reality. Their 5-inch guns were little more than firecrackers against the armored monsters they might soon meet. Their only real weapons were their torpedoes. Powerful, yes, but short-ranged. To use them, they'd have to close to within 10,000 yards, well inside the reach of Japanese main guns. As the sun dipped below the horizon on November 14th, the ships of Task Force 64 slipped past the western tip of Guadalcanal. The destroyers led in a long column, Walkie first, then Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. Behind them, the 2 great battleships followed, Washington ahead of South Dakota, 6 steel leviathans gliding silently into a graveyard. The sailors called it Iron Bottom Sound, a stretch of sea so littered with wrecks that it seemed to hum with ghosts. The twisted remains of Callahan's ships still jutted from the water, oil slicks glistening in the moonlight, bodies drifted in the current. Lee knew exactly where he was sailing. He'd read the reports, studied the charts, and understood the stakes. Ahead of him, Admiral Kondo was bringing a Japanese force that dwarfed his own, a veteran battleship, heavy and light cruisers and destroyers armed with the dreaded Type 93 long lance torpedoes, the most lethal in the world. The Japanese had spent decades mastering the art of night combat. Their lookouts could spot a silhouette in starlight. Their gunners could fight by instinct. For years, the night had belonged to them, but tonight, for the first time, they would be blind. Washington's radar swept the darkness like a silent eye, painting the unseen sea with precision. Lee and his operators could see the ridges of Guadalcanal, the peaks of Savo Island, and now, faint blips creeping closer, the enemy was coming. Just before 11 p.m., the radar plot aboard Washington came alive. On the glowing green scopes, a formation of enemy destroyers appeared, tiny specks sweeping ahead of a much larger body farther north. The range, 18,000 yards, and closing fast. Lee faced his first decision. He could open fire immediately, using radar to hit targets the Japanese couldn't even see, and possibly shatter them before they realized what was happening. But doing so would reveal his position. The enemy Admiral Kondo might cut his bombardment short and retreat before Lee could trap him. Or Lee could wait, let the Japanese commit, let them drift closer, deeper into his jaws. It was a gamble. If they spotted him first, his force would die in minutes. The silence on Washington's bridge was absolute. The range ticked down. 16,000 yards, 14, 12. The men could hear their own breathing, feel the hum of the ship's engines under their boots. The radar operators whispered updates like priests at a vigil 10,000 yards. At that distance, the Japanese should have seen them. 2 battleships, each nearly 700 feet long, were impossible to miss. But Kondo's men weren't looking behind them. Their eyes were fixed toward Guadalcanal, expecting American aircraft or coastal guns, not a hidden fleet of battleships stalking them through the dark. 8,000 yards. Lee had waited as long as he dared. He gave the order. At exactly 2300 hours, Washington spoke her 9 16-inch guns, unleashed a thunder that rolled across the sea like the voice of God. In a single instant, the night turned white with flame. 9 shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, tore through the darkness toward the light cruiser Sendai, a radar-locked target invisible to the human eye. 23 seconds later, the ocean erupted around Sendai, towering geysers of water drenching her decks. The first salvo missed, but barely. Lee corrected. The next volley came down on the Japanese destroyer Ayanami, the lead ship of the enemy screen. The impact was catastrophic. 1 16-inch shell, perhaps 2, smashed through her hull like paper, detonating in her machinery spaces. In seconds, Ayanami was ablaze from stem to stern, dead in the water. The sea erupted in answering fury. South Dakota opened fire, her own radar-guided guns roaring into the night. The American destroyers charged ahead to launch their torpedoes, streaking through the darkness toward the enemy formation. Japanese star shells burst overhead, turning night into an eerie green dawn. Searchlights lanced out. The calm order of the radar screens dissolved into chaos. Every ship was firing at something, friend, foe, shadow. It didn't matter, tracer fire crisscrossed the sea like threads of molten wire. The air was filled with the hammering of guns and the shriek of shells. It was the first naval battle of Guadalcanal all over again, except this time the Americans could see in the dark.
For a few precious minutes, the Americans had the upper hand. Their radar-guided guns struck true, and Japanese ships stumbled in confusion under the sudden storm of fire. But the advantage was fragile, one spark away from disaster. At 23:37 it came. Deep in South Dakota's engineering spaces, a technician tried to reset a faulty circuit breaker. He made a fatal mistake. A single switch was thrown the wrong way, and in an instant, every light, every radar, every director aboard the massive battleship went dead. Her guns froze, her screens went black, her power systems collapsed. The most modern warship afloat was suddenly blind, deaf, and helpless. Emergency generators kicked in, coughing out dim red light, but they could barely keep the pumps and radios alive. Without radar, without central control, South Dakota was fighting blind in the middle of a hornet's nest. The Japanese pounced. Searchlights from Kirishima and her escorting cruisers locked onto the stricken battleship, bathing her in silver light. Within seconds, every enemy gun that could bear opened up. 14-inch shells crashed through South Dakota's superstructure. 8-inch fire from the heavy cruisers Otago and Takao ripped through her upper decks. Explosions blossomed across her hull, spraying steel and flame. In less than 2 minutes, she took 27 hits. Antennas shredded, radar masts toppled, and her secondary batteries were silenced one by one. On the bridge, Captain Thomas Gatch was hit by shrapnel, but refused to leave his post. Around him, smoke and sparks filled the air. Men shouted through the roar of gunfire, trying to bring their wounded ship back to life. Ahead of her, the destroyers fared even worse. Preston was the first to die, trapped in a crossfire between Japanese cruisers. Her thin armor, no match for the barrage fire, tore through her decks until her magazines exploded, ripping the ship apart. 117 of her crew went down with her. Walker, leading the American line, pressed forward through the inferno, firing until a long-lance torpedo smashed into her side. The explosion broke her in two. Out of 250 men, barely 75 survived. Benham lost her bow to another torpedo, but somehow stayed afloat. Limping helplessly in circles, Gwynn, battered and burning, fought to rescue survivors from the wreckage, even as she herself began to sink. In 15 minutes, Lee's entire destroyer screen had been annihilated. South Dakota, the only other battleship under his command, was crippled and retreating, shrouded in smoke. And there, alone in the night, surrounded by 14 enemy ships, Washington remained. Every manual, every exercise, every bit of naval doctrine said the battle was lost. The smart move was to retreat. But on Washington's bridge, Admiral Willis A didn't see chaos. He saw opportunity. His radar still worked, and on its glowing screens he saw what the Japanese could not. Their formation was broken. Their ships were scattered, chasing ghosts and wreckage. He was invisible. Hidden behind the burning hulks of his own destroyers, the enemy hadn't even realized Washington was still there. Lee gave a simple, impossible order. All radios silent, maximum speed, course 030. The great battleship turned toward the enemy. One ship, alone, charging into the heart of the Japanese fleet. The ocean was chaos, burning wrecks, drifting men, the smell of oil and cordite thick in the air. Somewhere ahead, the Japanese were celebrating their triumph. They believed they had shattered the American force. They didn't know that death was already coming for them, riding low and silent on the Black Sea. Washington surged forward at 26 knots, her engines vibrating through the decks like a heartbeat. Inside the radar room, operators whispered bearings and ranges, their glowing screens mapping the unseen battlefield in perfect detail. Kirishima, 15,000 yards, 12,000, 10,000, closing. The Japanese still hadn't spotted her. Their searchlights were fixed on the crippled South Dakota to the south, hammering the dying ship with their guns. They never imagined a second American battleship was moving through the wreckage, stalking them unseen. At 8,400 yards, point-blank range for 16-inch guns, Lee gave the order. The night split apart. Washington's 9 great rifles fired as one, the flash blinding even through closed eyes. The first salvo straddled Kirishima. The next tore into her hull, then another, and another. Within minutes, radar-guided fire turned precision into annihilation. The 2,700-pound shells smashed through Kirishima's armor like paper, detonating deep inside her. One blew apart a forward turret, killing its entire crew. Another wrecked her engines. A third struck below the waterline, flooding her boiler rooms and locking her rudder hard to port. The proud Japanese battleship began to circle helplessly, her guns still firing wildly into the dark, unable to escape or even steer. Washington's secondary batteries joined in, raining down 5-inch shells that set her upper decks ablaze. Flames climbed the pagoda mast, consuming the bridge. Captain Iwabuchi Sanji, wounded but refusing to abandon his post, gave the only order left: fight until the ship died. Within 7 minutes, Kirishima was finished. She burned like a pyre in the middle of Iron Bottom Sound. Admiral Kondo, watching from his flagship, couldn't comprehend what had happened. No one could. The ferocity and accuracy of the fire made him believe he was facing multiple American battleships, maybe even an entire task force. In desperation, his cruisers Atago and Takao swung their searchlights toward the new threat and opened fire, launching 16 long-lance torpedoes. But Lee was already moving. Washington's radar tracked the torpedo wakes as they sliced through the water. "Hard to starboard," Lee ordered, calm as ever. The massive ship heeled over, turning just in time. The torpedoes hissed past her hull, some missing by only yards. Then she turned her guns on the Japanese cruisers. At 12,000 yards, her first salvo straddled Atago. The second came even closer, towering columns of water drenching her decks. For the first time that night, the hunters became the hunted. Admiral Kondo ordered his ships to retreat. Behind them, Kirishima was dying. Fires raged unchecked as flooding claimed her lower decks. Her list grew sharper by the minute. At 1 a.m., Captain Iwabuchi gave the order to abandon ship. The surviving crew gathered on the tilting deck, sang the Japanese national anthem, and gave 3 final banzai cheers before sliding into the Black Sea. At 3:20, Kirishima rolled over and slipped beneath the waves northwest of Savo Island. She took more than 300 of her crew with her. It was the first time in the Pacific War that one battleship had sunk another, and Washington had done it alone. When morning came, Iron Bottom Sound was silent again. The smoke had thinned into a gray haze drifting over the sea, the kind that hides both wrecks and miracles. All around, the price of the night's violence lay scattered across the waves. 3 American destroyers, Preston, Walker, and Benham, were gone. Gwynn was crippled and burning. South Dakota had survived, but she was a wrecked silhouette limping east, her decks scorched, her radars shattered, 38 sailors and 1 Marine dead, 59 more wounded. And yet, against every law of probability, the enemy was in full retreat. Kirishima, the pride of the Japanese fleet, veteran of Pearl Harbor and dozens of battles, was gone. Resting now on the sea floor, her escorts had fled north, broken and bloodied. The fleet that had come to destroy Henderson Field had been annihilated by 1 American battleship. At dawn, as the first streaks of sunlight glimmered on the wreckage, aircraft from Henderson Field spotted what remained of Japan's transport convoy dive bombers and torpedo planes descended like hawks. 7 of the transports were sunk in a matter of hours. Of the 11,000 soldiers they had carried, fewer than 4,000 reached the beaches of Guadalcanal, and most without weapons or supplies. The Japanese offensive was over. The Marines would hold the island. Guadalcanal would stand. Back aboard Washington, the crew began to realize the impossible. Through all of it, through the fire, the torpedoes, the chaos, not a single man on their ship had been killed or seriously wounded. The only damage she suffered was a single 5-inch shell that sliced through her radio antenna. It was unprecedented. In the most violent surface action of the Pacific War, the ship that had done the killing walked away untouched.
When Admiral Halsey received the news, he sent Lee a personal message. "You and your task force have written a glorious page in American naval history."
But in the official records, the victory was described as a defensive engagement. The truth was far more radical. Washington hadn't just defended, she had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. Word of the battle spread quickly through the fleet, but official Washington barely noticed. The reports called it a defensive success, a necessary but routine action. There was no headline, no grand recognition, no sweeping declaration of a tactical revolution. Admiral Lee's after-action report, which carefully detailed how radar-directed gunnery had decided the battle, was filed away without comment. To the Navy's upper ranks, the engagement off Guadalcanal was an anomaly, not a revelation. The truth was more uncomfortable. Within the Navy, two camps quietly warred over the future. The carrier men insisted that air power had rendered battleships obsolete. The gun club, clinging to tradition, still saw them as the centerpiece of the fleet, but mostly for show, not for innovation. Lee's victory didn't fit either narrative. His ship hadn't won because of brute force or size, but because of technology, radar, data, precision. And radar, to many old admirals, was an unsettling idea. It threatened the romance of naval warfare, the image of captains standing on open bridges, squinting through binoculars into the dawn. So the Navy quietly looked away. Washington's triumph was never framed as a breakthrough. The battle wasn't studied, its methods weren't taught, and the tactical procedures Lee had pioneered were left to gather dust in classified folders. Lee, ever the professional, said nothing publicly. "The important thing," he told his staff, "is that our men came home, and the Marines kept their island." But privately, he was frustrated. He had seen what radar could do, how it could save lives, shorten battles, and give America an edge that no enemy could match. He submitted report after report, recommending new training programs and radar integration systems for the fleet. Most were politely acknowledged, then forgotten. The war moved on. The Navy turned its attention to the next campaign. Lee's revolution was buried under bureaucracy. After Guadalcanal, Admiral Willis A should have been celebrated as the man who proved Battleship still had teeth. Instead, he became a quiet figure on the margins of his own revolution. He continued to serve with distinction, promoted to Vice Admiral in 1944, and given command of the Navy's fast battleship force, 6 of the most powerful ships ever built. But they were never unleashed as he'd envisioned. Doctrine kept them chained to the carriers, reduced to guardians for the flat tops rather than hunters in their own right. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Lee's ships formed a perfect battle line that could have intercepted and destroyed the Japanese surface fleet. Instead, they were ordered to stay behind, shielding the carriers. The chance slipped away. Months later, at Leyte Gulf, the same story repeated itself. Admiral Halsey led Lee's battleships on a chase after decoy Japanese carriers, leaving the invasion beaches nearly undefended. When Japanese surface forces struck at Samar, it was escort carriers and destroyers, not battleships, that stood in their path. Only their sacrifice saved the invasion. Lee, furious but disciplined, followed orders and said nothing. He knew what his ships could have done. He had proven it 2 years earlier in the darkness off Guadalcanal. But the Navy had already chosen its future, and there was no room in that vision for gunfire and steel. Even so, Lee kept writing. His reports and tactical papers argued for tighter integration between radar, sensors, and weapon systems. He pushed for a Navy that could see, think, and strike as one machine. A few younger officers listened. Most did not. On August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan's surrender, Lee died suddenly of a heart attack while being ferried to his flagship, the Wyoming, anchored in Casco Bay, Maine. He was 57. The news hit the fleet hard. Admiral Nimitz called him one of the finest officers he had ever known. Halsey said Lee's brilliance had saved countless American lives. The crew of Washington mourned deeply.
Many of them still believed that if anyone deserved to stand beside Nimitz and Halsey in the history books, it was Ching Li. But when the newspapers announced his death, most barely mentioned Guadalcanal. His Olympic medals got more ink than the battle that had changed naval warfare. Washington herself fared no better. She served a few more years, bringing troops home in Operation Magic Carpet. In 1947, she was decommissioned and left to rust in the reserve fleet. 14 years later, she was sold for scrap, cut apart for $500,000 worth of steel. No memorial, no museum, no monument. The battleship that saved Guadalcanal was erased piece by piece, as if her story had been too inconvenient to remember. Though Washington was gone and Admiral Lee buried, their fingerprints remained on everything that followed. The Navy might have ignored the lesson in 1942, but time eventually caught up with Lee's vision modern naval warfare, the kind fought with computers, missiles, and data links, was built on the same foundation he proved in that Black Sea off Guadalcanal, that information and precision could defeat brute strength, that technology, properly mastered, was the ultimate weapon. The Aegis combat system that now defends every U.S. cruiser and destroyer, the radar-guided nerve center of the modern fleet, is a direct descendant of the radar fire control integration Lee created aboard Washington. The seamless link between sensors and weapons, the ability to detect, track, and strike beyond visual range. All of it traces back to the night one ship fought blind and won. Even the core ideas Lee preached in his reports, speed of decision, unity between machines and men, fighting where the enemy cannot see, are now etched into the doctrine of modern naval combat. He was, in every sense, decades ahead of his time. Yet the irony is sharp. The revolution Lee began came too late for the ships he loved. By the time the Navy truly understood what he had shown them, the era of the battleship was already over. Missiles had replaced shells. Jets had replaced scouts. Steel giants like Washington became relics in museums, if they were lucky enough to survive the scrapyard. But Lee's idea survived. It lives on every time a destroyer launches a missile at a target it can't see, guided only by the invisible hand of radar and computation. It lives in every integrated bridge and combat system that fuses information faster than human eyes ever could. In that sense, Washington never died. Her spirit and Lee's genius became the blueprint for the Navy of the future. Decades have passed since that November night off Guadalcanal. The waves that once burned with fire now roll quiet and blue. Hiding the wreck of Kirishima somewhere below Washington herself is gone. Her steel melted down, her name unspoken in most histories. Yet her legacy still whispers through every radar pulse, every missile launch, every ship that fights by seeing the unseen from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the cold of the Korean coast to the heat of the Persian Gulf. The lessons Willis Lee proved in a single night have outlived him, that technology multiplies courage, that training and preparation can outmatch numbers, that one ship, in the right hands, can change the course of a war. It's easy to remember the great names, Midway, Iwo Jima, Missouri. But Washington deserves her place beside them. She was the ship that fought alone, the one that defied doctrine and saved Guadalcanal when everything else had failed. Her victory was buried because it embarrassed the experts. It proved that the old ways were wrong, and institutions rarely honor the people who expose their blind spots. But truth endures longer than memory. And the truth is this: Washington and her crew did the impossible. They walked into a trap, faced a superior enemy in total darkness, and emerged without a single man lost to enemy fire. That kind of perfection doesn't happen by chance. It happens when preparation meets courage, when leadership meets innovation. 82 years later, their story still matters, not as nostalgia, but as warning. Every generation of sailors faces its own iron-bottom sound, a moment when convention and courage collide. The ones who prevail are those who remember what Lee proved, that technology is only as powerful as the people who dare to trust it. So if you remember one thing from this story, let it be this: A forgotten battleship once changed the future of naval warfare, and did so in silence. USS Washington deserves more than obscurity. Her crew deserves more than fading names in a logbook.
And Admiral Willis A, the quiet marksman who saw in radar the shape of tomorrow, deserves his place among the great captains of history. Because what they achieved that night wasn't just victory, it was proof that innovation, courage, and conviction can still rewrite the fate of nations.